Hello and welcome to today's lesson, which is on the charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. First thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some context behind Tennyson himself, and then we're going to look at the historical event that inspired the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. So, Alfred Lord Tennyson was one of the most important poets of the Victorian period. He was the poet laureate, the country's official poet, from 1850 until his death in 1892. So the poet laureate, as I've said, is the country's official poet, something we still have today, and the most recent poet laureate was Carol Ann Duffy. So his poems range often the ranges on historical events. His poems range from those focused on the legends of King Arthur to those dealing with the loss of a loved one. So sometimes they take a more personal form as well as focusing on historical events. So the next thing we're going to have a look at is the Crimean War and find some more information about it. So the Crimean War took place between 1853 and 1856, with Imperial Russia on one side and an alliance of Britain and France on the other. So Britain didn't have a direct interest in the war, but they chose to involve themselves with it. So the poem takes place during the Battle of Balaclava, one of the many battles of the war. So the battle was a complete disaster. The Light Brigade was supposedly being sent in to face a relatively easy target. However, a strategic mistake was made by a senior commander, Lord Raglan, which meant the Light Brigade were thoroughly outnumbered and suffered heavy casualties, as they were a small Light Brigade of around 600 soldiers were sent in to fight many times that, and they were completely surrounded by soldiers on horseback, soldiers who had superior weapons than them. So the poem describes the advance made by the Light Brigade during the Battle of Balaclava, part of the Crimean War. The poem chooses to glorify the brigade, celebrating the sacrifice they made for the country. So even though the actual battle was a complete disaster, the poem still glorifies the soldiers who gave their lives. In the poem, there is a balance between realistic depiction of the violence experienced by the soldiers into the mouth of hell and the glory of dying for one's country. The poem presents the soldiers as a unit rather than as individuals, hence Charge of the Light Brigade, and the focus and almost the character is the Light Brigade rather than any individual soldiers. So it reinforces the view of how honourable it is to be part of an army with a common purpose rather than acting on an individual level. So the poem is written by Tennyson at a great distance from the events depicted in the poem. He wasn't a soldier, he didn't witness the battle. So this gives the poem a rather distant quality, although this would have reflected the feelings of the people reading newspaper reports in Britain that describe the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to read through the poem before analysing it in line by line detail. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew. Someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. Boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. That they that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made. Honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. Okay, so let's start off with the first stanza where it says half a league, half a league onward. So the word league in this context is actually a unit of measurement, a unit of distance, and it's roughly 3 miles. So this describes the advance of the Light Brigade as they're advancing towards the Russian soldiers. And obviously this is a battle that they're going to lose horrifically and catastrophically, but they're marching towards a certain death, as they're going to be, when they get to the Russians, they're going to be completely and utterly surrounded by them. So this certainty and inevitability of death is reflected in the next line, all in the valley of death. So it suggests that this whole environment and location is just completely associated with death, and that really this fate that they will die is absolutely concrete, is absolutely certain. The Valley of Death is also a biblical reference, so suggesting that although they may die, that their fate has been almost approved by God, and that actually glory awaits them after death. It's interesting, if we look at the word death, it has a capital letter, almost personifying the concept of death into a character. So the 600, it says, rode the 600, forward the Light Brigade. So again, despite everything and despite the almost impossible odds that they face, they carry on marching forward. So the next line, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death. So there's this command, charge for the guns, and at this point it sounds like a battle that they could possibly win, and these are normal commands. It doesn't sound hopeless. There's a very positive tone to charge for the guns as a command, the exclamation mark, very positive. But again, there's this repetition of the phrase, the biblical phrase, valley of death. So however positive they are in their intentions, there is a suggestion that their fate of death is almost inevitable. And they keep riding towards this inevitable fate. We've got the last line of the stanza, rode the 600. So the next stanza, it says, forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? So Tennyson is questioning here. Now this Light Brigade are charging towards a certain fate of death. And he sort of questions and imagines, out of all of these 600 men, did any of the men get depressed as they looked on at their fate, as they were charging towards the possibly thousands of Russian soldiers that were surrounding them? Did they dismay? Did they get down? Did they get depressed about their fate? Or did they keep honourable, as it were? Did they keep a brave, stoic face? So the next line, not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. What does this word blundered mean? It means someone's made a mistake, and the mistake historically was made by Lord Raglan, who, remember, Lord Raglan was the man who sent these 600 men to their deaths unknowingly. He thought that the 600 were marching towards a much smaller army. However, ultimately they were sent on a kind of suicide mission, because They were never going to win against the thousands of Russians who had more sophisticated equipment and were superior in numbers. Now, these next three lines are very interesting. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. So this is the significance of the unit of 600. We don't get any names of the soldiers. The character is very much the 600 soldiers. And the idea here is it's not the job of soldiers to make political decisions. The soldiers don't make command decisions. They literally follow orders, and if their orders are to attack a location, that's what they'll do. So it says here, there's not to make replies. It's not up to them to reply to a more senior commander. There's not to reason why. So it's not up to them to ask questions. Why are we doing this? Why do we have to follow this? That's not the job of a soldier. Theirs but to do and die. So this is where the bravery of the 600 is really celebrated here. They know that there's a fair chance that they will die, but they keep marching. Such is their bravery. So they continue into the Valley of Death, and this anaphora that's now been repeated 3 times, emphasizing their certain fate of death. So rode the 600 into the Valley of Death. It all seems fairly certain what's going to happen to them. So to give a bit more detail to their fate, we have these next 3 lines. So picture this before we read through the next 3 lines. You've got 600 soldiers, a light brigade, and they are marching towards a location. And when they get to this location, they are going to be completely surrounded by Russian soldiers. So this is the point of the next 3 lines. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them. So this repetition here of the word cannon, cannon, cannon represents how completely surrounded they are, how completely hopeless this mission now is, because they have no chance of escaping this sea of cannons. So volleyed and thundered. So this clear use of onomatopoeia with thunder, and we've got some sibilants here as well in the 5th line. Stormed at with shot and shell. So it's almost a bit of a tongue twister, but the repetition of the SSS sound almost creates a bit of a hissing sound that perhaps imitates bullets whizzing through the air. So again, as I've said, this poem is absolutely a celebration of the 600 soldiers who, despite perhaps knowing, or at least halfway through their mission, they knew that it was their fate was almost inevitable. Boldly they rode and well. So they're skillful riders, and at no point do they show any doubt or hesitation. They are riding boldly towards their fate. So some metaphors here into the jaws of death. So again, it just represents how overwhelmed they will be once you ride into the jaws of death. Really, there's no way out. And this death, again, if you notice, has a capital letter, which normally it wouldn't do, but it's almost a personification of death. Death is a character, and death is about to claim the lives of these 600. So another interesting metaphor here into the mouth of hell. Tennyson really wants to capture how grim the situation is. And if you picture this, 600 men, they're being shot at with cannons, they're completely surrounded. You know, this is going to be utter carnage. There's going to be bodies everywhere, very graphic scenes. And if you're a soldier caught amongst this, and your fellow soldiers and friends are being slaughtered by the 100 in front of you, this is, as you can imagine, going to be a very hellish situation, and it's really captured with these 2 metaphors: jaws of death, mouth of hell. But the 600 carry on, and we get this anaphora here: rode the 600. Despite all of the obstacles that are put in their way, they keep riding in a very stoic and heroic fashion. So let's have a look at the fourth stanza. Flashed all their sabres bare. So what is a sabre? I like almost good way of remembering it is thinking about a lightsaber. Um, and actually, what this is a sword. Okay, so lightsaber is handheld. That's as far as that comparison goes. But in a way, in complete contrast to a lightsaber, the saber is actually just a typical sword, and this almost reflects the odds being stacked against the 600, whereas the Russians had um, lots of artillery, lots of cannons. Mostly the British were still using swords. And at this point, believe it or not, swords were actually starting to be considered a rather archaic tool of war in comparison to heavy artillery. So repetition of flashed here, flashed as they turned in air. So it's celebrating the sophistication of the fighting in terms of their skill levels, that they're flashing their sabres and that they're heroically fighting on. Sabering the gunners. So this shows you how clearly overwhelmed they are, but also how brave they are. Sabering the gunners. They are using swords on people with guns. They're going to keep doing it because they're brave and heroic, and that's the point of this poem. Charging an army while all the world wondered. So this heroic 600 with their swords are trying to fight people with cannons and guns while all the world wondered. What are the world wondering about? Will they be reading about this news story um, at home and perhaps wondering why it is, why are we over in Russia fighting this battle? What effect does that have on our lives? And perhaps they're wondering politically about the likes of Lord Raglan, who made that catastrophic error in sending the 600 um, into a location where they were clearly overwhelmed by the Russians. So the world of wondering about the political decisions that led to this disaster, but they're not wondering about the bravery of the soldier. That's absolute. So really emphasising the hellish situation even more. We've got plunged into the battery smoke, so the cannons are firing so much that there's just almost a fog of smoke. Right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian. So this is obviously reference to the opposition, the Cossacks and the Russians, reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. So at first they seem to have some sort of success against the Russians with their sabres, with their swords, as they're such valiant fighters. Then they rode back, but not the 600. So Tennyson's really making the point here again and again. Not the 600. The 600 are brave warriors. They're not just going to run away. They might be being overwhelmed with heavy artillery and cannons, but they're not going to retreat. They're not cowardly. These are brave warriors. Okay, so let's start stanza 5. What's interesting about stanza 5? It's very similar if we go back to stanza 3, but there are subtle variations in it as well. So let's have a look at the first 3 lines. We've got cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell. So all of this is very similar to stanza 3. So again, the repetition of these lines really emphasizing how completely surrounded and overwhelmed the British were. So the next line, while horse and hero fell, they that had fought so well. So this again is really lionizing and celebrating and glorifying these men who gave their lives and also the animals as well. Horse and hero fell, that they had fought so well, came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. So interestingly, despite everything and despite the fact that there were so many obstacles put in their way, some of the 600 did escape the jaws of death did come through the mouth of hell. And Tennyson almost sets this up as an impossible task. How can you escape the jaws of death? How can you come from the mouth of hell? But some of the 600 did. And this is quite, in a poem which is filled with some stunning metaphors, this is a very simplistic line. All that was left of them. And again, there's almost a power in what's not said. All that was left of them. We know here that we're talking about some heavy fatalities left of the 600. We know here that many have died, but the poem doesn't go into statistics and details behind this, but it powerfully implies here that many of the 600 died. So this is really cuts to the heart of the poem, and the message of the poem when it says, "When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made." So despite the fact that it was a catastrophic mission, the 600 should still be celebrated in history, and in a way we're doing that right now by reading the poem. We are keeping that memory of the 600 alive, and of course that was Tennyson's intention. So all the world wondered. Again, there's almost a political question mark here. Who made that decision? We know it was Lord Raglan, but what other leaders involved in politics should have been held to account in terms of this catastrophic mission that they were sent on? And really, these final three lines of the poem sum up how Tennyson would like us to remember the 600, honour the charge they made. Okay, so remember the actions that they remember the actions of the 600, celebrate the sacrifices they made, and it just sums up the poem with the final three words: noble 600. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the form and structure of. Okay, so we'll just have a look at the form and structure of the poem. So the poem is made up of 6 stanzas representing the 600 soldiers. There is variation in both the size and the shape of the stanzas, and this could reflect the chaos of war. So the fact that there is a great deal of variation in the size of the stanzas could represent that war is never neat, it's never ordered. Although the campaign started off with good intentions, where the 600 were sent to take on a manageable number of Russians, actually, when they got to that location, they were brutally overwhelmed in a chaotic fashion, with cannons going off everywhere, guns being shot. This is very chaotic, so it makes sense that the form of the poem would reflect that chaos. So in terms of the structure of the poem, and remember that when we're talking about structure, we're generally talking about the rhyme scheme of the poem and the meter of the poem. So there is not a consistent rhyme scheme in the poem. However, there is some rhyme in the poem, although it's not consistent. Perhaps we can make a similar comment, and maybe the inconsistency of the rhyme scheme again reflects the chaotic and unpredictable nature of war. Although the British tried to predict war and they thought, right, if we invade this area, then we will have a victory, actually that's hard to do, and a mistake was made. And unpredictably, like the unpredictability of the structure and the rhyme scheme, the British were overwhelmed. Okay, so the poem is written in dactylic meter, so it all sounds very complicated. However, this could be represented in terms of stressing of syllables, like dum, dee, dee. So the first syllable in every 3 is stressed, followed by 2 unstressed syllables. It goes dum, dee, dee, dum, dee, dee, dum, dee, dee. So the meter could represent the clip-clop rhythm of charging horses, the charging horses of the 600 in the Light Brigade. I hope you found that video helpful, and if you have a look at my YouTube channel, you will find other lessons covering the poems in the Edexcel Conflict series.